Captain Marcus Steele had never been to this part of the galaxy before. His starship, the Vanguard, drifted quietly through the deep black of space. The communication system beeped unexpectedly, the sound cutting through the silence of the bridge. Marcus glanced at the blinking light on his control panel. It was a distress signal, weak but still there. It came from an uncharted planet, far from any known human colonies. "Bring it up on the main screen," Marcus ordered, his voice calm but alert. The officer at the communications station quickly tapped a few buttons. A map of the star system appeared on the screen, highlighting the distant planet. The distress signal was coming from the surface. "Send a recon team." "I'll go down myself," Marcus said, grabbing his helmet from the table. He didn't know who, or what, was in trouble, but he couldn't ignore a distress signal. It was his duty to help. A few hours later, Marcus found himself standing on the surface of the strange planet. The ground was barren and rocky, with a reddish hue. Towering cliffs loomed in the distance, casting long shadows as the twin suns set behind them. The air was thin but breathable, and the sky was filled with swirling clouds. The planet seemed empty, but the signal had led him here for a reason. "Captain Steele, you should be cautious. We have no idea who sent that signal," his second-in-command, Lieutenant Davis, reminded him over the comms. Marcus nodded, adjusting his helmet. "Understood. Keep the ship on standby in case I need backup. I'm going in." He moved toward the source of the signal, carefully stepping over jagged rocks and uneven ground. His boots crunched loudly on the dusty surface, the silence of the planet only broken by the occasional wind gust. As he reached the location indicated by the signal, he froze. There, in front of him, stood a group of alien soldiers, clad in dark, ornate armor. They were surrounding a figure in the center, a woman, tied to a pillar. Her appearance was striking. Tall, with dark purple skin and glowing eyes, her long white hair cascading down her back like a silver waterfall. She was beautiful, yet her expression was one of pure fury. Marcus instantly recognized her. Princess Zyra, the heir to the Drakani throne. The Drakani were known across the galaxy for their fierce warriors and their deep hatred for humanity. They had fought numerous wars against human colonies, and peace between their species had been difficult to achieve. Zyra glared at Marcus, her eyes full of contempt. "You, human, what are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice cold and sharp. Marcus kept his distance, observing the scene carefully. The soldiers around her looked tense, but none moved. It was clear they were waiting for something. "I'm here to help," Marcus said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I received a distress signal. I'm Captain Marcus Steele of the Terran Starfleet." Zyra's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. "Help? You are no friend of mine, human. I don't need your help." Marcus didn't flinch. He had dealt with hostile alien leaders before. "I don't know who sent the signal, but I'm here now. You're in danger. Let me help you." Princess Zyra's eyes narrowed. "I am no helpless victim. I can take care of myself." She tugged at the ropes that bound her, but they were tight. One of the soldiers, a tall male with black scales covering his skin, stepped forward. "You are too late, human," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Princess Zyra's fate is sealed. She has betrayed her people, and now she will pay the price." Marcus's eyes flicked between the soldiers and the princess. Something didn't add up. If Zyra had truly betrayed her people, why was she tied up and surrounded by her own soldiers? This wasn't a typical situation. Without hesitation, Marcus drew his blaster from his side and aimed it at the soldier. "I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not leaving until I get some answers." Zyra's eyes widened for a split second before she returned to her usual defiant expression. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, human." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. The tension in the air was thick. Marcus knew he had to act fast. He turned to Zyra. "I don't know why they're treating you this way, but I'm not leaving without you. Whatever your people have planned, it's not happening." Zira seemed taken aback by his words. She had been ready to fight to the death if necessary, but something about Marcus's resolve made her hesitate. For the first time since he arrived, she saw him not as an enemy, but as a force to be reckoned with. "I don't need your help," she repeated, but her voice lacked the strength it had before. The walls she had built around herself seemed to crack, just a little. Marcus stepped forward, lowering his blaster slightly. "You can resist all you want, but I'm not going to leave you here. Not like this." The soldiers didn't move, and Zyra's gaze shifted from Marcus to the men around her. She could see they were waiting for her to make a decision. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "Then, human, you will serve me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You will help me escape," Zyra said, her voice steady once more. "If you want to help so badly, do it on my terms." The challenge was clear, and Marcus knew this was just the beginning. But one thing was certain: this encounter was far from over. Marcus Steele had never imagined he would be in this situation. He had come to help, to answer a distress signal. But now he was standing on an alien world with Princess Zyra, the woman who had made it clear she hated humanity more than anything. Her glowing purple eyes fixed on him with a sharp, calculating gaze as they walked together through the rocky terrain. "You're making a mistake," Zyra said, her voice still full of defiance. "I don't need your help. I never asked for it." Marcus kept his pace steady, ignoring the venom in her words. "You may not have asked, but you need it. You're tied up in something bigger than you realize. Your people seem to want you dead, and I'm not just going to stand by and let that happen." Zyra stopped and turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You speak of my people as if you understand them. You don't. You're nothing but a human." Her voice was cold, the bitterness clear. "I don't need to understand everything to know when something's wrong," Marcus replied calmly. "And right now, something's definitely wrong." They had been walking for over an hour, and the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the alien landscape. The planet was strangely quiet, as though it was holding its breath. Every step they took seemed to echo in the empty air. Zyra had stopped resisting him, but Marcus could feel the weight of her dislike. She wasn't ready to trust him yet, and he understood that. After all, he was a human, a member of the very species her people had been at war with for years. He had no illusions about what she thought of him. But he also knew he couldn't leave her to face whatever danger was waiting. "We're not going to survive out here if we don't work together," Marcus said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I don't know who betrayed you, but I'm not going to let them win." Zyra crossed her arms over her chest, her lips pressed into a tight line. She was clearly angry, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm not going to bow to you, human. I won't be a puppet in your hands." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not asking you to bow to anyone. I'm offering you a partnership, not control." They continued to walk in silence, the only sound being their footsteps on the rocky ground. As they moved deeper into the wild terrain, Marcus couldn't help but wonder why Zyra had been betrayed. She was the princess, the heir to the Dracani throne. Why would anyone want to harm her? As if sensing his thoughts, Zyra spoke again, this time her voice quieter. "You don't understand the politics of my people. They fear me because I don't want to follow their ancient ways. I want to change things, to make a future that isn't ruled by bloodshed." Marcus slowed his pace, sensing a shift in her tone. "What do you mean? What are they afraid of?" Zyra hesitated, then continued. "I wanted peace. I wanted to make an alliance with other worlds, including yours. I believed that if we worked together, we could create something better. But the old guard, they couldn't accept that. To them, weakness is a crime, and when they saw that I was reaching out to humans, they saw it as a threat." Marcus nodded, understanding a bit more. "So they betrayed you for wanting peace." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Yes, they thought I was too weak, too soft. And now, because of that, I'm here, on the run, with nowhere to go. Marcus paused for a moment, his gaze softening. He had heard stories of the Dracani, tough warriors who valued strength above all else. But this was different. Zira wasn't just a princess. She was someone who genuinely wanted change. She was a leader, and she had been betrayed by the very people she had been trying to protect. You don't have to do this alone, Marcus said quietly. I'll help you, but we'll need to stick together. No more running. We fight this together. Zira looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't trust you, human. But I don't have a choice, do I? Marcus smiled, though it was small. Not really. But if you give me a chance, I'll prove I'm not your enemy. Zira didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. There was a long, uncomfortable silence between them, filled only by the sounds of the wind and their footsteps. Eventually, Zira nodded, though it was almost imperceptible. I'll hold you to that, human, she said, her voice still cold but without the same intensity of before. They continued walking, their path winding through the harsh landscape of the planet. The stars were just beginning to appear in the sky above, a blanket of distant light that seemed so far out of reach. It felt like the calm before a storm, tension in the air, and a sense that everything was about to change. As the night settled in, Marcus couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. A dangerous road lay ahead, but he was ready to face it, by Zira's side, whether she liked it or not. Together, they would have to navigate the storm that was coming, a storm neither of them could predict. But for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Zira than just the hatred she had shown him. The following day, Marcus and Zira set up camp in a narrow canyon, sheltered from the harsh winds that swept through the barren landscape. The twin suns were high in the sky, casting an orange glow over the rocky terrain. It had been a long day, and the air was thick with tension, but as the night fell, things seemed a little calmer. Zira had insisted on taking the first watch. She was a warrior, after all, and Marcus respected that. He had his own reasons for trusting her, though. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about her, something beyond the royal blood or the anger she wore so openly. Sitting on a boulder near the edge of the camp, Marcus tried to relax. His fingers grazed the control panel on his wrist, running through the status of his communication systems. There was still no sign of his ship or backup, but he couldn't afford to let that distract him. Zira, meanwhile, was scanning the dark horizon, her eyes sharp and alert. Though she had said she didn't trust him, she was beginning to understand that working with him might be her only way out of this mess. You're still thinking about your ship, aren't you? Zira's voice broke through the silence, her tone both curious and accusatory. Marcus glanced over at her, offering a half-smile. I can't help it. I'm used to having control over my situation. But you're right. Right now, it's just the two of us. She didn't reply immediately, but Marcus could feel her eyes on him. When she did speak again, her voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. I don't understand you humans, she said. You fight. You take risks. You never seem to stop moving forward. It's almost frustrating. Marcus chuckled softly. I can't deny it. We're not always the most patient people. Zira turned her gaze back to the darkened horizon. I've seen your kind in battle. You don't know when to give up. It's like you refuse to lose, no matter the odds. Marcus frowned, surprised by the sincerity in her words. That's the thing about humans. We don't always win, but we never give up. That's what sets us apart from everyone else. Zira looked over at him again, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it almost seemed like she might say something more, but then she turned away, her sharp features softening just slightly in the moonlight. The silence between them stretched on, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the heavy silence of distrust. It was more like a quiet understanding beginning to grow. though neither of them would admit it. As the hours passed, they took turns keeping watch. Zira remained a silent, watchful presence, her eyes scanning the landscape with a focus that Marcus couldn't quite match. He could tell she was trained for this. Her movements were precise, her posture rigid and ready. But there was something else in her. Even now, as they camped together in this alien world, Marcus could see the weight she carried. It wasn't just her royal status or the expectations of her people. It was the burden of leadership, the desire for change in a world that didn't want it. Eventually, Marcus couldn't keep his thoughts to himself any longer. He had to ask. "You said you wanted to make peace with the humans," Marcus began, his voice low and careful. "What made you want that?" Zira paused, and for a moment, Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen enough bloodshed in my life," she said. "Wars, betrayals, all for the sake of power, for the sake of ruling. It's never about the people. It's about control. I wanted to change that. I wanted peace, but no one would listen. They wanted war. They wanted to crush the humans, and anyone who stood in their way." Marcus didn't interrupt, letting her words hang in the air. There was a heaviness in her voice, a sadness that spoke of countless battles fought, not with weapons, but with ideals that were too fragile to survive in the face of ancient traditions. "I thought if I reached out, if I could show that we weren't enemies, maybe something would change," she continued. "But the elders, they couldn't accept it. They didn't want peace. They wanted power." The quiet was thick with the weight of her confession. Marcus could see the pain in her eyes, the regret that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had tried to do something good, and yet she had been betrayed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice soft. "I didn't know." Zira shook her head, her expression hardening once more. "No, you don't need to apologize. I made the decision. I just didn't think it would end up like this." Marcus nodded. No one ever does. There was a long pause before Zira spoke again, her voice steady, but with a hint of something more, something deeper. "You know, for a human, you're not as bad as I thought," she said, almost as if testing the words. Marcus smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." She didn't smile back, but her eyes softened, just a little. The walls that had been built between them, the walls of anger and distrust, were starting to crack. Slowly, they were beginning to understand each other, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. As the night wore on, they both knew the road ahead would be dangerous. But in this strange, silent moment, there was something else, something unexpected, a spark of connection between them, fragile but real. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey. But for now, they sat together in the quiet of the canyon, two people from different worlds, learning to trust one another, piece by piece. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as Marcus and Zira traveled through the harsh alien terrain. They made their way toward the nearest settlement, Zira's last known contact before the betrayal. Despite the dangerous situation, Marcus noticed that Zira's attitude toward him had softened. The sharp, cold edge in her voice wasn't gone, but it was quieter now. The long silences between them were no longer filled with tension. Instead, there was a subtle understanding. As they moved, they grew more efficient, their routine falling into a rhythm. Zira would take the first watch, her keen senses always on alert, while Marcus would rest, knowing that when his turn came, she would keep him safe. However, as the days wore on, Marcus began to notice something strange. They were being followed. It started with subtle signs, footprints in the dust, faint sounds in the distance, a slight rustling in the brush. At first, Marcus thought it might be his imagination. After all, they were on an unfamiliar world, and the landscape was full of strange noises. But as the days went by, the signs grew clearer, and it became undeniable. Someone, or something, was tracking them. One evening, as the two of them sat by the fire, Marcus decided to bring it up. "Zura, we're not alone," he said, his voice low and cautious. Zura didn't seem surprised. She had been watching the horizon for hours, her sharp eyes scanning the area. Without looking at him, she spoke, her tone neutral. "I've known, but it doesn't matter. We'll deal with it when it's time." Marcus frowned. "You knew, and you didn't say anything." "I didn't want to worry you," she replied, finally meeting his gaze. "Besides, worrying about it won't change anything. We need to keep moving. If we stop, we'll be vulnerable." Marcus nodded slowly, respecting her decision. "All right, but we need to be ready for whatever is following us." That night, Marcus didn't sleep as soundly as he had the night before. He kept his senses sharp, listening for any sounds that might signal danger. But it wasn't until the early hours of the morning that the real threat showed itself. A sudden loud crack from the bushes broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Marcus was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the weapon he'd brought with him. Zira was already moving, her body tense and ready for whatever came next. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness, its body covered in thick, armored plating. A creature unlike anything Marcus had seen before, and definitely not human. It was alien, but its movements were unmistakably hostile. Zira stepped in front of Marcus, her eyes flashing with a mixture of recognition and caution. "It's one of them," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. "The ones who betrayed me." The creature growled, its red eyes narrowing as it sized them up. It wasn't alone. From the darkness, two more figures appeared, both equally imposing. They were hunters, assassins sent to capture Zira and silence anyone who stood in their way. Marcus instinctively moved closer to Zira, his body tense, ready to protect her. "You knew they were coming, didn't you?" Zira's expression darkened. "I didn't expect them to find us this quickly, but yes, they'd been after me for a long time." Marcus didn't have time to process her words. The first assassin lunged forward, moving with terrifying speed. Zira reacted instantly, her weapon drawn in a flash, her movements precise and deadly. She was a trained fighter, and it showed. The assassin barely had time to react before Zira's blade found its mark, cutting through the creature's armor and sending it collapsing to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The other two assassins were already moving in, their weapons raised and ready. Marcus felt his heart race as he instinctively reached for his blaster, but Zira was faster. She darted forward, her body a blur of movement as she engaged the second assassin, her blade dancing through the air with deadly accuracy. The third assassin hesitated, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. Zira's eyes locked onto it, and she spoke in a low, commanding voice. "You're outnumbered. Leave now, and I might let you live." The assassin seemed to consider her words for a moment, but the hesitation was brief. It let out a loud, screeching noise, a call for backup. Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before more would arrive. They had to move fast. "Zira, we need to go now," Marcus shouted. Zira nodded sharply, already moving toward him. She had taken down two of the assassins, but the third was still standing, its eyes burning with fury. Without a second thought, Marcus fired his blaster, striking the assassin in the chest. It fell to the ground, lifeless. "We don't have time to waste," Marcus said, his voice urgent. "Let's go." Zira didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted toward the narrow pass that led deeper into the canyon. Marcus followed closely behind her, his heart pounding in his chest. They couldn't stay here any longer. The danger was real, and they had to keep moving if they wanted to survive. As they ran, Marcus couldn't help but think about the bond that had begun to form between them. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, the hatred, and the uncertainty, Zira had fought to protect him, and he had fought to protect her. They had no choice now but to rely on each other, to survive together. The road ahead was uncertain, But one thing was clear. They were in this together. And nothing, not even the threats hunting them, could tear them apart. The sound of running water filled the air as Marcus and Zira made their way through the narrow canyon. The sky above them was dark, and the only light came from the twin moons hanging low on the horizon. The air was cool, and the dry, rocky ground underfoot was littered with debris from the recent battle. They had barely escaped the assassins, but they couldn't stop. The threat wasn't over, and the need to move was urgent. They had left the bodies of their attackers behind, but Marcus knew that more would come. Their enemies wouldn't give up so easily. Zira led the way, her pace steady and determined. She had barely spoken since the fight, her eyes focused ahead. Marcus couldn't help but admire her strength. She was a warrior, not just by title, but by nature. She had fought, protected him, and had done so without hesitation. He had expected her to be bitter, to hold a grudge against humans for the way her people had treated her. But there was something else in her now, something that went beyond hatred. She was tired, worn down by a life of constant struggle. And yet, she still fought, for herself, for her people, and for their survival. As they walked, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of connection growing between them. It was subtle, a quiet bond that had formed in the heat of battle, during moments when their survival depended on each other. It was unspoken, but it was there, and it was undeniable. "We need to find shelter," Zira finally spoke, her voice low and steady. Marcus nodded in agreement. "I've been thinking the same thing. We can't keep moving like this. We need rest." Zira glanced at him briefly, her eyes unreadable. "I can go on, but if you need rest, we'll stop, but only for a short while. We can't afford to waste time." Marcus understood. She wasn't just concerned for herself. She was thinking about the bigger picture, about their survival. The weight of their journey had become heavier, but Zira was still focused, still determined to push forward. It was something Marcus respected, even more than before. "I'm good for now," Marcus replied. "But we have to be careful. Those assassins will be looking for us. They won't stop until they have what they want," Zira said, her tone hardening. "But we'll make sure they don't get it." There was a fire in her voice, and Marcus could hear the resolve in her words. It was clear that Zira wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for something much more important. Something he didn't fully understand yet, but he was beginning to see it in her actions. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the terrain grew more treacherous. The rocks were jagged, and the narrow path forced them to move carefully. But Zira was unbothered, her movements fluid and practiced. She had spent her life navigating difficult environments, and this was no different. Marcus, on the other hand, struggled a bit more, but he did his best to keep up. After a few more hours of walking, they found a small cave tucked away behind a cluster of boulders. It was hidden, safe from view, and would provide them with the shelter they desperately needed. Zira didn't hesitate to enter, and Marcus followed her inside. The cave was cool, the walls rough and uneven, but it was a welcome respite from the dangers of the outside world. Zira immediately began to unpack their supplies, and Marcus set up a small fire in the center of the cave. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and the crackling sound of burning wood was the only noise that filled the air. Once the fire was going, they both sat down, each lost in their own thoughts. The tension from earlier in the day had faded, replaced by the quiet of the cave. But even in the silence, Marcus could feel the weight of their situation. They were far from safety, and the threat of the assassins was still very real. Zira broke the silence first. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice almost curious. Marcus looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "I guess I'm just thinking about all this, about everything that's happened." Zira nodded, her gaze distant. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it? We were enemies once, but now we're fighting the same battle." Marcus sighed. "I never expected it to end up like this. I thought we were just going to keep fighting, keep doing what we do best. But I've learned a lot in these last few days." "Like what?" Zyra asked, her tone softer now. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. Like how quickly things can change. How people can go from being enemies to allies. I've learned that we have more in common than I thought. We both want the same thing, peace, but we're stuck in this cycle of violence. Zyra was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Then she spoke, her voice tinged with a hint of vulnerability. I didn't want this life. I didn't want to fight. But I had no choice. I still don't have a choice. Marcus could see the pain in her eyes, the deep sadness that she tried to hide behind her fierce exterior. It wasn't just the fight against the assassins. It was the fight against her own people, against the expectations placed on her as a princess. You don't have to fight alone, Marcus said, his voice sincere. We're in this together. I don't know what's coming next, but we'll face it together. I promise you that. Zyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like the world outside had disappeared, and it was just the two of them, sitting in that cave, sharing a quiet moment of understanding. Finally, Zyra nodded. Together. Then, Marcus smiled slightly, relieved. It wasn't much, but it was something. In a world full of chaos and danger, the one thing he could count on was that they would face it side by side. As the fire burned low, they settled in for the night. The cave provided them with shelter, but the future was uncertain. Whatever came next, they would have to face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt hopeful, not just for his survival, but for the possibility of peace, however unlikely it seemed. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft golden light across the landscape when Marcus and Zyra packed up their camp. They had only slept a few hours, but the need to move was more urgent than ever. They couldn't afford to rest too long. There was a new danger closing in on them, one they couldn't ignore. As they walked, the silence between them felt different now. There was no tension or distrust, only the shared understanding that they were in this together. They had fought side by side, survived together, and now they were bound by something stronger than just their circumstances. It was a quiet alliance, one that neither of them fully understood yet, but both knew was essential for their survival. I think we're safe for now, Marcus said, breaking the silence as they made their way through a dense forest. The trees were tall, their thick branches blocking most of the sunlight, but the shadows made them feel more exposed. Zyra glanced around cautiously. Safe for now doesn't mean safe forever. We have to keep moving. Marcus nodded. He understood. They couldn't stop. Every step they took brought them closer to their destination, and closer to danger. But they had no choice but to push forward. I know, he said, but we need a plan. We can't keep running from whoever is after us. Eventually, they'll catch up. Zyra's eyes narrowed, her expression dark. I've been running my whole life. It's not just them I'm trying to escape. It's the life they want me to lead. But I'll fight them if I have to. I get it, Marcus said. He had seen enough of her strength to know she wasn't just talking about the assassins. She was talking about a life forced upon her, a life that had no room for freedom. He didn't know all the details, but he could sense it in the way she carried herself, like a person constantly on the edge, never able to truly relax. They walked for several hours in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The landscape around them was stark and unforgiving, but neither of them complained. They were survivors, and survival meant enduring whatever the world threw at them. As the sun climbed higher, Zyra suddenly stopped, her eyes focused on something in the distance. Marcus immediately tensed, instinctively scanning the area. There was something in her expression, something he couldn't place, but it was enough to put him on alert. What is it? He asked quietly. Zyra hesitated, then nodded toward the horizon. I think I know where we are. There's a settlement nearby. One of my allies might be there. Marcus frowned. An ally? Zyra didn't look at him as she spoke. Someone who might be able to help us, but they're not exactly trustworthy. It's a dangerous place, but it's our best chance of getting the information we need. Marcus wasn't sure what to think. An ally was something they desperately needed, but if Zyra didn't fully trust them, it made him wary. Still, they had no better options. They had to take the risk. "We'll have to be careful then," he said, his voice steady. "But if they can help us, it's worth it." Zyra nodded, her eyes hardening. "We're not looking for friends. We're looking for help, and I'll do whatever it takes to get it." The two of them moved forward cautiously, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The terrain began to change as they neared the settlement. There were signs of life, structures in the distance, and the faint sounds of voices. But it didn't look like a peaceful place. The buildings were old and worn, the streets narrow and littered with debris. "This doesn't look like a friendly town," Marcus said, his voice low. Zyra didn't answer right away. She was watching the entrance to the settlement, her expression unreadable. "It's not. It's full of criminals, smugglers, and people who don't ask questions. But if you want to stay alive, sometimes you have to make deals with people like that." Marcus didn't argue. He had seen enough of the galaxy to know that not every place was filled with good people. Sometimes survival came down to making uncomfortable choices. As they walked closer, Zyra slowed, her hand moving to the weapon at her side. Marcus did the same, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. They had to be ready for anything. When they reached the entrance, Zyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded to a guard standing at the gate. The man was large and imposing, his face covered in tattoos, but when he saw Zyra, his eyes widened in recognition. He stepped aside without a word, allowing them to pass. Marcus raised an eyebrow as they walked through the gate. "You've been here before." Zyra didn't respond immediately. "I have," she said finally, "but not for a long time. Things have changed." They entered the settlement, and Marcus immediately felt the tension in the air. The people here were rough, their eyes constantly shifting, watching for any sign of weakness. It wasn't a place for the faint of heart, but Marcus had seen worse. He wasn't afraid, but he was cautious. They made their way toward a small building at the center of the settlement. It was tucked away in a corner, far from the main street, and looked even more rundown than the rest of the area. Zyra walked confidently, her pace steady, but Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. As they reached the door, Zyra paused and turned to him. "Stay close. Don't trust anyone here, not even me." Marcus met her gaze, his expression serious. "I trust you, Zyra, but I'll be watching my back." She nodded, then pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, a figure sat at a desk, his back to them. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold demeanor. He turned as they entered, his eyes narrowing when he saw Zyra. "You've returned," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Zyra didn't flinch. "I need your help, and you're going to give it to me." The man chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Help? You'll have to make it worth my while." Marcus could feel the tension in the air, thick and dangerous. Zyra wasn't here for a simple conversation. She was here for something much more important, and he had a feeling it would cost them both more than they expected. The air in the dimly lit room was thick with tension. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken as he watched Zyra and the man exchange cold, calculating looks. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation, but Zyra had no choice but to go through with it. She needed this man's help, no matter the cost. The man, whose name they had yet to learn, leaned forward, his fingers tapping slowly on the desk. His sharp, calculating eyes never left Zyra. "You think you can just waltz in here and ask for my help without offering anything in return?" His voice was low, almost too calm, and it sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "What makes you think I'll help you?" Zyra didn't flinch. She had faced worse in her life, and she wasn't about to back down now. "You owe me, Corin," she said, her voice steady. "You owe me for what happened all those years ago, and you'll pay me back now." Corin's expression darkened. He stood up slowly, his large frame towering over them. That was a long time ago. Things change. You think I'd risk my life for a promise made in the past? Marcus took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. He didn't trust this man, and from the way Zyra reacted, neither did she. But he also knew that without Corin's help, they would have no chance of surviving whatever was coming. Zyra, however, remained calm. You want a deal, Corin. Fine. You get what you want, and I get what I need. A fair exchange. Corin's lips curled into a sly smile. And what is it that you want so badly, princess? I need information, she replied, her voice firm. About the people after me. About their plans. You can get it for me, or I walk out of here. Corin paused, considering her words. His eyes flicked to Marcus briefly before returning to Zyra. He was clearly weighing his options, but in the end, his desire for power won out. You're right. I can help you, he said finally, a twisted grin spreading across his face. But I'm going to need something in return. Marcus stepped forward, his patience running thin. What do you want? Make it quick. Corin held up a hand, silencing him. You'll get your information, but not without a price. There's a job I need done, one that no one else can handle. Zyra nodded, her expression unreadable. What kind of job? I need you to retrieve something for me, Corin said, leaning back in his chair again. It's not far from here, but it's heavily guarded. I'll give you the details once you agree. Marcus exchanged a glance with Zyra. He didn't like the sound of it, but they had no choice. This was their only chance to move forward, and they had to take it. We'll do it, Zyra said, her tone unwavering. Corin nodded, pleased. Good. I'll send you the coordinates, but remember, this is a one-time deal. Once you complete the job, I'll give you the information you want. But if you fail, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Failure meant more than just disappointment. It meant danger, and Corin wasn't the type to forget or forgive. Zyra turned to Marcus, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had never been afraid of taking risks, but even she knew how dangerous this job was going to be. She wasn't one to back down, but the weight of the decision hung heavily between them. We don't have a choice, she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthening. I know. We'll do whatever it takes. They left Corin's building with the coordinates in hand, the sun now beginning to set behind them. The streets of the settlement felt different as they made their way out, darker, quieter. The people they passed seemed to watch them with cold, suspicious eyes, but neither of them cared. They had a mission now, a dangerous one, but it was theirs to finish. Once they were outside the settlement, Zyra stopped and turned to Marcus. We'll need to be prepared for anything. The guards won't just let us walk in and take what we need. Marcus checked his gear, his mind racing with the possibilities. They had no idea what they were up against, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. He had already seen Zyra's strength, and he knew she could handle herself. But this time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their future. What's the plan? He asked. Zyra's eyes darkened with determination. We infiltrate. We grab what we need, and we get out before anyone notices we were there. Simple. Marcus didn't doubt her for a second. She was ready, and so was he. Together, they could handle whatever came next. As they set out toward their destination, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever happened, they had each other's backs, and as long as they stayed together, nothing could stop them. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something even bigger.